Hello, my name is Jamila Glover, and I'm going to briefly talk about the differences that takes place within the Scrubs episode, particularly season 4, episode 17, My Life in Four Cameras. In this episode, it um, shows the differences of how a typical episode of Scrubs deals with real life situations versus how a sitcom type um, Scrubs episode would uh, go. So the opening scene, actually throughout the entire episode, there's a lot of intertextuality going on. The first scene is opening with Sanford and Sons theme song, and the closing scene of the episode is going out with Cheers theme song. Both of these shows were originally aired on NBC, as was Scrubs originally before being switched over to ABC. Um, so as I was saying, there are some differences depicted in a typical Scrubs episode and a sitcom type episode. Some of the things that I noticed immediately were the fact that the typical episode used multi cameras to get shots of the scene, whereas the sitcom type show basically used one camera shot and they kind of zoomed in and out. Um, Also, one of the differences is the lighting. The lighting for the typical Scrubs episode was kind of dark and it had the setting that you were like really actually in a hospital. Whereas the sitcom episode had really bright lighting, the set was brighter, and it gave you a set type feeling like you were sitting in a studio audience and a laugh track was added. Um, in this episode, there were real life situations that came up, and I'll give you the comparisons of how the situation was handled in a typical episode versus how they were handled in the sitcom episode. Um, One scenario was Dr. Cox was faced with having to fire a staff member, which he clearly found to be difficult for him. But this is something that happens in real life and people have to deal with. Um, so in the typical episode, it showed him eventually in the end having to fire him. But in the sitcom episode, um, things were happily ever after because, you know, instead of Dr. Cox having to fire the staff, the hospital came up with a talent show to raise the salary for this staff, and they actually did not have to fire him at all. So that's a happily ever after situation. Another scenario that came up was Turk and Carla. They wanted to start to spend more time with each other just to show each other how much they love each other. You know, they said, okay, at 12 o'clock we're going to meet at this time and give each other a kiss and go on with our lives. But, you know, typically this is not the way life is, really. But, you know, they tried it and it didn't work, real life situations. Um, Whereas in the sitcom, they showed that, you know, they were having some difficulties coming together and finding time to spend with each other. But in the end of the sitcom type episode, they were able to come together and have a love song sang, and they went home and it was happily ever after. Sitcom type situations, not always like that, but you know, of course, sitcoms can make it seem that way. And I think the most prevalent situation for this particular episode was when the patient, James Charles or Charles James, I'm not really sure which way it went, was a patient, and you know he found out that he was terminally ill. Um, and a little history behind the name of the patient, James Charles, comes from the creators of Cheers, which was referenced in the episode a few times. I believe the creators are Les Charles, um, Glenn Charles, and James Burrow. So combination of all the creators' names in there for this patient's name. Anyways, the patient found out he had cancer and that he was going to die. Again, another real life situation that Scrubs, um, you know, a typical episode of Scrubs is sure to encounter. Um, for the sitcom version of this same scenario, uh, the cast came in and say, "Oh, it turns out you don't have cancer. It was a different patient. You're not James Charles. You're Charles James, so you're not sick anymore." And it was kind of happily ever after. But you know, turns out typical episode, the patient did end up dying. So these were some common differences that went on in this episode of Scrubs.